Continuing here on Motorsports Today, I'm Eddie Kalegi. Well, it's the off season for NASCAR, so we figured it was a good chance to try to get some drivers on the air. And one of the most interesting driver stories in the NASCAR National Series right now is joining us here. He raced in the Craftsman Truck Series this season for RBR AM Racing. Stephen Mallozzi, thanks for joining us here on Motorsports Today.
Pleasure to be here, man. Happy to do it.
So I always like to ask first the background. What led you to first get into the aspect of motorsports and eventually pursue an opportunity in NASCAR?
So when I was a kid, I always loved little cars, little toy cars, and that kind of turned into a love for video games, which turned into one day I said to my dad after I won the championship on NASCAR Thunder 2004, I'm like, hey, pretty good at this stuff. Like, I bet you I'd be pretty good at it in real life. And he's like, that's not really how it works. So I went to a go-kart track for my 9th birthday. I did literally just indoor rental sessions day after day, week after week for like 3 or 4 years. Then I did competitive kart racing. So like open wheel, no seat belts, 90 miles an hour type go-kart racing. National champion, runner-up. I was Team USA representative, one of the best in the country. Then my dad got sick. Cancer, really sad. And I retired. I left racing for a while. I got into sports media, did a lot of that stuff. I worked for ESPN at one point. I worked for TobyChristie.com. God, what else did I do? I did a bunch of stuff here, there, and none of the other. But then one day I was moping about the fact that I never got to go to NASCAR. And I was at home. It's COVID. Dad walks into my room and is like, what the hell is your problem? I'm like, Dad, never got my shot to go racing. And he's like, well, let me tell you something. If I treated my cancer the way you treated racing, I would have been dead 5 effing years ago. Turns around and walks away. Doesn't say anything else. So that kind of inspired me. I started emailing team owners, and one connection led to another. It was actually 76ers ex-commentator Mark Zumoff who started the chain of reactions that got me to my connection, Josh Rayum, in Charlotte. And I moved down there before the semester ended, and I ended up doing an internship. One thing led to another, started digging, started making some connections, and before you know it, I ended up making my NASCAR debut at Mid-Ohio last year. So pretty crazy. Yeah.
It's a crazy turn of events. And let's talk a little about that college experience too, because I'm recording this show at Rutgers at the student radio station. You could have ended up here, and then you ended up instead at UVA. So walk us through that process.
Yeah, could have ended up at Rutgers. Obviously, I'm a New Jersey guy, South Jersey. I was just at Rutgers for the OSU game. Really thought they were going to pull up an upset there for a minute. But I was going to go to Rutgers because I'd been offered one of their full ride scholarships, all inclusive type deals. And I'm like, damn, that sounds pretty nice. And I did not get that treatment at Virginia. But my dad is a Virginia law alum and said that he thought in order to get to the best law school possible, that I had to go to Virginia. And I'm very sentimental about my old man. And with his condition, when he was first diagnosed, this was in 2016, they had given him 6 months. And we were around a year and a half, 2 years when I was deciding where to go to undergrad. And I'm like, Rutgers is like an hour away. It's a night trip if I really wanted to. Virginia's like 4, and they're not going to let me have a car. And I told my dad that if Virginia won March Madness, I would go down with him for a tour. And of course, Virginia wins March Madness. So we go down and we tour, and he books me for some stupid sophomore tour that is like not meant for seniors. It's meant for lower level high school students. I'm like, Dad, I really don't want to do this, man. He's like, I really don't want to do this either. I'm like, listen, I'll make you a deal. And he had already gotten in touch with the dean. He's like, let's go get lunch. We'll go to meeting with this dean that you have scheduled. And if this dean says that I can have a car, I'll let you put down the admissions deposit and I'll go to Virginia. And the dean was like, yeah, we'll let your kid have a car. It's no big deal at all. So I ended up going to Virginia and bailed on Rutgers and ended up going to UVA for undergrad. So now I'm a lot closer. I'm at Temple for law school, so I'm not that far. But yeah, sadly had to It could have been very different too. I think if I had gone to Rutgers, I never would have been able to pursue NASCAR. And that's because Virginia, while it wasn't close, wasn't far from Charlotte. It was 3 hours from RBR's shop.
Mhm.
Made it so much easier to commute back and forth than 9 hours slash a plane ride would have been for Rutgers.
Yeah.
Um, so at the end of the day, that decision actually ended up being hugely beneficial. The other thing too is Virginia took a whole other semester after Rutgers did to stay on Zoom. That extra semester is the semester where I ended up moving to Charlotte and doing that internship and all that stuff because I could just keep doing classes on Zoom. I don't think I would have been able to do that at Rutgers as easily, because I think Rutgers went back that semester and it would have been a lot more challenging to manage, even if they had given me accommodations and allowed me to separate. And by the way, whole chain reaction story that happens here that makes it questionable as to whether or not the events would have occurred that got me to Charlotte in the first place. But yeah, I think it's a pretty crazy story. I do think that at the end of the day, if I had gone to Rutgers, I don't think I would have ended up in NASCAR. I think I probably would have ended up somewhere else.
And I mean, it does make sense when we've seen how NASCAR obviously has expanded more nationwide and with the Clash now happening in Los Angeles and all that, and the street race in Chicago. But we know the core base is down in North Carolina, South Carolina, and you really want to be in that Charlotte area if you want to
Yeah.
pursue a career in the sport. So, yeah, it definitely made sense there. But yeah, ended up getting that opportunity, ultimately made your debut at Mid Ohio last year and ran 4 more races this season. But maybe the most interesting one was when you got that Outback sponsorship on the truck. So I know you worked at Outback and that ultimately led to that opportunity. So how did that come about and what did it mean to you to have a sponsor like Outback and be representing them on the track?
So a few things. One, greatest employer on the face of the planet. I freaking love Outback Steakhouse. And it's crazy because I've loved Outback Steakhouse since I was a kid. My birthdays, Outback Steakhouse. My dad and I, after every go-kart race we went to, we'd find, no matter where in the country we're, California, Florida, Texas, New York, Outback Steakhouse. We'd find one, we'd go eat there, and we'd get the same thing every time.
What was that? What was the go-to meal?
It used to be, it's no longer called this, but it used to be called the Outback Special, which was a 6-ounce sirloin and 2 sides, and I would always get a house salad and a baked potato or a house salad and clam chowder, depending on the location. Yeah, I was always cooked rare, extra toppings on the potato if I got a baked potato. So when I first was getting jobs that I felt like I had wanted to do that paid decent, I was a pizza delivery guy. Got one too many speeding tickets. Never on the job, always off the job. But off the job, got too many speeding tickets to the point where their insurance wouldn't cover me. So they let me go. So I couldn't deliver anymore. And I'm like, damn, what's a job that's like delivery? Maybe not quite delivery. That I can keep doing. I'm like serving. Like, what's my favorite restaurant? Outback. I'm gonna go be a server at Outback. And that happened for a couple of years. And they were always awesome about traveling, school, racing. They always let me very, very accommodating towards my schedule and let me keep having a job, which was huge for me because I needed money. So one day, a whole chain of events happens that gets me to Martinsville this year. And that's a whole other story. But I ended up going to Martinsville with a bunch of companies that I had worked with during that internship time. There were a bunch of gambling companies or like, gambling partners, podcasts, whatever. I had done gambling analysis for a few different websites before I was a NASCAR driver because one of the ways I made my money was before I was ever an insider in NASCAR. Obviously, that's not allowed, so I had to stop. I would sports bet on NASCAR, and because I had been such a super fan of the sport, when the odds first came out and it came back after COVID, all of the sports books jumped on NASCAR, but they didn't realize that there were huge opportunities for profit, and I ended up making somewhere in the range of $15,000 to $20,000 in that season before I moved to Charlotte. So one of my internships was I was a gambling analyst for a few different people, including the Action Network. And one of the connections I made through the Action Network was a guy named Nick Giffen, who ended up being my primary sponsor in Martinsville. We run Martinsville, absolute crapshoot. Race gets on and off, rain delayed. It's insane. It's terrible. We have a battery failure, 36th. Not the race we wanted. I'm miserable. It's a 3-hour drive back to Charlottesville to my apartment where I have a shift the next morning at Outback. I get back at 3:30, maybe a little later. Next morning, I'm up and serving people their blooming onions. And I'm sitting at that shift at about 4 o'clock, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, all these people, they have no idea that yesterday I was on TV as a NASCAR driver. So I wrote a tweet about it, like, hey, this is what it's like being a small-time guy. Yesterday I was at Martinsville. Today I'm at Outback. Just a guy. And I ended up finding Outback's marketing director, and I tagged her in it. A month goes by, and one day I walk into work and they tell me, they're like, somebody saw that tweet. And, there's some conversations, and then conversations spiraled. And before you know it, we had come to the conclusion that, hey, we would do Bristol Motor Speedway as an Outback Steakhouse NASCAR race, which is absolutely crazy to think about. Brett Patterson, who's the CEO of Outback, actually called me on race day, which is nuts. Because for me my dad and I always talk about Outback. Like, it was even before we were NASCAR, we were just karting as a teenage kid. We'd always talk about it, and it was crazy to have them finally on board. And it was a huge point of validation in the grand scheme of my career that really just made me feel whole about everything I had done. And to have an employer like that who backs me is something else. I mean, the sunglasses I wear, Outback branded, maybe you can't see that. I'm wearing an Outback hoodie right now. I've got an Outback backpack. Just love the brand through and through. And I love that the brand is a brand that's willing to give back to me and support me as a race car driver.
That's awesome. And as someone who enjoys the sweet chicken mine sandwich from Outback Steakhouse, it's great to see.
Oh, I got some bad news. We took it off the menu.
Oh, man. Well,
yeah, I do know. I can't have a job for my first semester in law school, so I haven't had any shifts, but I do eat it Outback all the time. We took it off the menu.
I'll find another option. There's definitely out there to choose from.
Yeah, you're gonna have to, man. I got the recommendations for you if you need them. So,
well, I appreciate that. But yeah, so that's an incredible story with that, and obviously that race holds significance, as does Mid Ohio when you made your debut. But from a racing standpoint, of the 5 tracks that you've run, the 5 races you have run, what was your favorite experience so far in terms of the 5 tracks you've gotten to experience at the NASCAR level?
Pocono. I think I'm going to say Pocono. And here's why. One, I love the speed of it. So I actually really enjoyed Gateway as a racetrack, but it was such a horrible experience, which, again, we don't need to delve into. There's a whole article about it on TobyChristie.com that you guys can read, who is also one of my sponsors, so support them, please, about my Gateway experience. But it was so hellish that it doesn't even qualify as one of my favorite racetracks. Martinsville's too chaotic, and I think the experience of the race itself, maybe I'd enjoy the track a little more if the race experience weren't so hectic. Bristol, I got my ass kicked. Terrible. The most exhausted I've ever been. The most ejected I've ever been after a NASCAR race, after any race. Mid Ohio was just, holy crap, I can't believe I'm doing this. And I feel like that I'm so overwhelmed with emotion that I was more focused on just not embarrassing myself. Pocono was the race where I felt like, hey, I got it. Like, we're racing people, we're avoiding crashes. It's a big, fun, speedy racetrack. I will say this. The most intimidating thing in the whole wide world is when you've never been on a racetrack bigger than 1.25 miles and you look down Pocono's front straightaway and you come out of turn 3 and turn 1 is a haze in the distance. Like, you can't see it. And you're just sitting around for 13 seconds like, it's really nice ceiling of this race car, flat out all the way down the front straightaway until you get to turn 1. And turn 1, you don't really use the brakes. I mean, you are pretty much just a quick lift and back on the throttle. And that is something that is psychologically really difficult to wrap your mind around. It was so much fun, though. It was the first racetrack I really felt like I got to use some racecraft. And, we had a piece of equipment that was really competitive. And I was really happy about that.
The last question for you, Stephen, is someone who's raced for Reum Brothers, AM Racing, some of these smaller teams in the sport. There's been a lot of conversation and chatter in NASCAR ever since the charter system came into form about opportunities for the little guys, because we know there's the big market teams that are always there. From your experiences now getting to race these past 2 years, How do you feel about that? Do you think there are really enough opportunities out there, or is there's still ways to go for NASCAR to give people like you and others a real shot to compete in the national series?
Uh, Short answer, no. Um, I think what I did is such an outlier in the grand scheme of what you see in race car drivers today. And like, I'm not tooting my own horn, just the reality of it. I'm a student. I'm a part-time server. I sold my car to do a race. Like, I'm really just grinded and hope that things would keep sticking. And so far, they sort of have. But at the end of the day, right? Like, I'm getting experience by the wheel of a race car, building my brand image, but I am not paying for race winning cars, right? Like, I'm not a race winning car is $170,000 a race in the truck series, right? So when you talk about opportunity in the past, before digital marketing, before the decline of cable, before all these other, maybe the decline of popularity in NASCAR, which is a potential factor, NASCAR truly was popular enough to be worth a $2-3 million a year investment for some of these brands, because where else are you going to get that many millions of eyeballs on one thing at one time? Now there's a lot of different ways to do it. So there's a disconnect between the advertising value of a race winning truck and the cost of a race winning truck. So you end up finding people to plug that gap who have personal interests. And most of those people are the parents of race car drivers who are executives at multi-million billion dollar companies. And that is a little problematic for our sport, right? I will say it's less problematic than it would be for a sport like football, where talent is much more inherent. In racing, a lot of people can become good race car drivers if you get the reps. And the people who are going to get the reps are the people who have the money to spend to get behind the wheel. So I think it's really difficult these days because, and also another thing is too, like in the 70s, 80s, if we're talking about Busch and Cup Series guys, if you knew how to build a race car, it didn't matter how much money you had. If you could build a fast car, you could show up to the track and run, top 20, top 15. Nowadays, that's much less true, right? Like a charter, we just saw Live Fast sell their charter for millions and millions of dollars, right? Like the amount of advertising it takes to get behind the wheel and operate these teams are crazy. So there's a lot of different factors, a lot of different aspects. You have to climb the ladder, and climbing the ladder costs money. And the advertising dollars might be in the Cup Series, but by then you've already had the only people who make it far enough and win races in the lower division to make it to the Cup Series are people who have spent a lot of money in the lower levels. So maybe there is a path, but for me, like, I'm not sure what the hell else I could do to make it further in the sport. I landed a big time corporate sponsorship, and that is much more than 90% of the truck series could say, right? Like that is one of the 3 to 5 most recognizable brands in the truck series. And I even go as far to say it might even be in the 3 to 5 most recognizable brands in all of NASCAR this year. And at the very least, it's in the top 10. It's not an easy thing to do. You have to find incentive. And for me, the advertising dollars that were spent by this company were to show, hey, like, look, we support our employees. And that is 100% true. It's been true of all the experiences that I've ever had. But if Outback were to sponsor someone who weren't a server, I think it'd be a different story, right? And I think that's why, their presence with other athletes has been much lessened within the sport over the course of the past few years. And their support of me as an athlete much more has to do with the fact that I'm an Outbacker and the fact that, they do all of this hard work behind the scenes to really back their employees. And I think that angle is really interesting for them. But at the same time, I think when it comes to the context of the question, hey, is there a way for drivers to make it? It's a tough way to make it. I have to have a part-time job behind me to make those truck series starts that I made. So it's a tough scene. I'm interested to see maybe if this new TV TV deal provides more money to the team so that the purse money becomes worthwhile and can maybe allow talent-based drivers to get behind the wheel as opposed to funded drivers. We'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, and it's funny. We've had this conversation actually on this show before. Back in the day, with the brand identity with some of these drivers, Tony Stewart's the Home Depot guy, Jimmy Johnson's the Lowe's guy, and we don't have that as much anymore with some of these sponsorships. So, like you said, it's very difficult to really get your foot in the door. But for you, you did have that great opportunity come up, and we're definitely looking forward to see what the next steps will be for you. But Stephen Mallozzi, sort of a renaissance man in the sport, sports media to Outback, to a NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series driver. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us here on Motorsports Today.
Thanks for having me anytime, man. Appreciate it.